Good evening, everyone. Aleph Book Company and Crossword is delighted to have you join us for this discussion on the book Song of Draupadi by Ira Mukoty. The book released earlier this month and has received rave reviews from readers and media alike. The novel is a symphony of Draupadi's voice and those of the other women around her, arguing, pleading, reasoning, and often raised in righteous anger. This is Ira Mukoty's first novel, who in the past has delved into best selling nonfiction titles such as Akbar the Great Mughal, Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire, and Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History. She writes rigorously researched narrative histories that are accessible to the lay reader. We're also excited to have amongst us oral historian and author Aanchal Malhotra, who would be in conversation with Ira today. She is the co founder of the Museum of Material Memory, a digital repository tracing family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and antiques from the Indian subcontinent. Archel writes extensively on the 1947 partition and its related topics, and this reflects in her first book, Remnants of a Separation. Over to you, Archel.
Thanks so much, Gitu. It's such a pleasure to speak to you, Ira. And you join us now from France.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, where you are working on another book. And we were talking about this earlier. You're the only writer to have two books out during a global pandemic.
I think that may be a record, yes.
Well, yeah. Anyway, so this is the book for everyone who's joining us today, Draupadi, Song of Draupadi. And Ira, the first thing I want to ask you is all of the work that you've done previously has been on women. You write almost exclusively on women, barring Akbar, of course. And I read in the acknowledgements that this was your first manuscript, though it is your fourth book. So why were you interested in going further back than the Mughals, which is usually your area, or even the medieval era, back to the Vedic age?
Yes, that's thank you, Aanchal, for being here with me today. It's really wonderful to have you to chat to. So this question about the book is, I think, one that I'm going to face pretty often. And the thing is that A Song of Draupadi chronologically is my fourth published work, but it is actually my first manuscript. I think people are a little confused with how have I come to fiction after writing so much history. But actually what happened was, currently I'm reading Sapiens by, Yuval Harari. And I was delighted to find a conclusion that he comes to, where he tells us that for 2 millennium, sapiens were around with their big brains and their tools, but they didn't advance very much in terms of their societies and culture and technology. And then suddenly a change happened during the cognitive revolution. And the way he explains this is there were other changes. There was the domestication of fire, for example. But there was this very important thing that happened about 70,000 years ago, was that our language came into being as this very flexible thing that we now possess. And we were able to create fiction. We were able to create myths and stories. And actually, at the end of the day, this is what bound us together as human beings, as sapiens, this is the thing that enabled us to find a common cause with people that we did not know intimately. So this building of myths, as you like, is something that has fascinated me. And we have this in our societies around the world, this tendency to create foundational myths. So this could be at the level of nations, as nation states, we tell ourselves certain truths that we as a nation are like this other nation is something else. But we also have it at familial levels, as a family, as small clans and groups. We tell ourselves familial myths, which are passed down the generations. And I think what happened, what I started thinking about, is that there are certain things that happened, like you would know about it only too well, is that a lot of us were dislocated after the partition, and we lost our immediate connection to our roots, to our familial mythologies. And another thing that has happened in India, in urban India, is migration for economic reasons. So in the big cities, you often see these small nuclear families that are not of that city. From Delhi, how many people, those who are not from Shah Jahanabad, old Delhi, are really not Delhiites at all, really. Right. So,
Yeah.
people are moving, are coming to cities in search of, better prospects, and they lose the village connections, the clan connections, the extended family connections. And who are the people who keep our myths alive? Is often the older generation, the matriarchs often, and we don't often give importance to the people who are actually the guardians of our stories, older women. So what happened to me was I was in a similar situation, in Delhi. My father was from Bengal, in undivided Bengal, and so there was not much for me when I have two small girls. When they were small, they're no longer small. I did not have access to this mythology of mine, to familial mythology. And I started thinking about this, that as my girls were growing up, what could I present to them to give them a sense of belonging, of roots, of identity? And I knew that I would be, competing with very interesting figures and people like Nicki Minaj, and Ariana Grande, and the people who would grab the girls'
Right.
attention, right? So these had to be figures who were inspiring and bold and fierce. So I was thinking about this for a long time, and initially, my very first idea, was to write something around Krishna. There's something of a Krishna obsession in my family. My daughters are named Yashoda and Devaki. So I thought if I had a Krishna as a central figure, I would look at his relationship with a variety of women around him, like Radha, and Yashoda, and Draupadi, and Kunti. But the more I looked at the epic, the more I looked at the Mahabharata, the more I realized that this was not the ideal situation, I had expected to find. That these women were not really given the sort of, freedom and freedom of expression and liberty that I hoped to find because of their association with Krishna. And very similarly to the Ramayana, I found a lot of these women were expected to be highly socialized, the way they are presented to us in popular culture and in writing. That women have to be a certain way. They have to be deified, they have to be whitewashed, they have to behave in certain ways, they have to repress anger, and all these things that I started understanding more and more. Just made me dissatisfied with the sort of stories I wanted to tell. And then I came across Draupadi and the women of the Mahabharata and the untapped rage of Draupadi. And this was something that really resonated with me because of the way in which, for example, someone like Sita is expected to be this perfect woman, the symbol of perfect Indian womanhood, this Pativrat. She does everything absolutely down to the letter. She's a perfect wife, she's perfect in every way. And yet she is humiliated, yet she go through the fire sacrifice, yet she is repudiated by everyone. And that filled me with fury. And I said, I can't tell my girls this. I can't tell them that no matter what you do and no matter how much you force yourself to behave a certain way, you will still never be good enough. So I thought I would go back to the Mahabharata instead and look at this series of women instead and look at the way that they were able to navigate the social order that they inhabited.
And I guess it goes back to that, very popular thing where it is you write what you want to read.
Yes,
If the book
correct.
doesn't exist, then you write it.
Exactly.
So I'm very curious about your process.
Mhm.
I am someone who's currently transitioning from nonfiction to fiction.
Okay.
And I'm curious about how the balance, whether there is a balance, whether you completely switch off one from the other. How is it working on two different kinds of genres?
So that's an really interesting question, Anchal, and there are similarities and differences. I think because of the way I write and the way I approach my work, there are actually a lot more similarities than there would be with perhaps another writer of fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, like I
So
didn't find the style to be so different from your earlier books
my
at
other
all.
books, yes. That's
Right.
right. So I think the research process was actually very similar. I have a background as a natural scientist, so I use this all the time. When I first started researching the Mahabharata, of course, I'm limited by the fact that I'm not a Sanskritist, so I can only read translations. And so I read translations, and I used what is called, the critical edition of the Mahabharata. So scholars in the early 20th century went through many of the sources because, this Mahabharata was written over centuries. And after the Sanskrit writings, there were regional language translations and there were oral, traditions. So in the early 20th century, there was this attempt to make a critical edition which compiled all the Sanskrit writings about the Mahabharata, found areas of overlay, and then used those exclusively and left the other bits outside only as footnotes. So this is the one that a lot of scholars use, though there is controversy over it. So I read all the texts that I could and all the interpretations, the feminist interpretations and other scholarly interpretations. But then what I also did was to risk, because I knew that I wanted, when my reader read the book, I wanted them to get a sense of what life would have been like during the Vedic times, during the times of the epic. Very tactically, if you like. I wanted them to be able to feel what it felt like to live in those centuries. So I did a lot of research around the condition of people's lives in the Vedic times. So a lot of time was then spent doing that sort of research. So this research process was very similar to what I do for my nonfiction. But I think the last thing I did, which is something that I don't do as such for the nonfiction, is uh, to think very deeply on what my words would sound like. What the phraseology would be like, what the cadence of the book would sound like. Because after all, this is an epic we're talking about. It's a very beloved epic, which is written in poetry. So I wanted that feeling of an elegy almost. A lyrical feeling. When you read the book, it felt familiar. The people felt familiar, but yet there was a sense of lyricism, of poetry being read, even though, of course, I write in prose and not in poetry. But I wanted to keep that slight distance so that people would remember that, yeah, this is an epic story, which is being retold in the 21st century, but nonetheless, there is that feeling of an elegy happening.
I think that carries over mostly because we know where it comes from, and it's familiar to us. So the other thing, your research may be similar, but also the arrangement of your text is quite similar, because though the book is called Song of Draupadi, I heard you say in another interview that it was really like a chorus of the women of the time.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could, and they're all connected, they're all woven, sort of embroidered into Draupadi's life. The book begins with her, the book ends with her, but in the middle there are so many characters.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could take us through your cast of characters, as it were.
Definitely. And this is the naming of the book, Song of Draupadi, is actually just, it's a very prosaic marketing decision.
Right.
My publishers are always getting me into trouble, because for Akbar they wrote the definitive biography underneath, and I was like, no, this is not the definitive biography, this is my biography. But they were like, no, this is how we will market it. And so I got into some trouble for that. And then Song of Draupadi, I'm constantly asked about why is it only Draupadi, and I wanted something like the chorus of the women, like a Greek chorus, like this mass of voice rising and falling. But no, they felt that Song of Draupadi actually makes it simpler for a reader to understand what this book is about and not create confusion.
On that note, I do want to say, as I was reading it, and I kept the title in my mind, because you discover pretty early on that it's not just about her, even though the first few chapters may be about her. In my head, I started imagining it as her singing this ballad of these women.
Yes.
And that's what kept me going, because I said, okay, yes, this is possible, and she can sing it. And I felt like it kept me afloat throughout the book, which is a really breezy read, by the way. Like you just sing through it.
Yeah, I'm glad. I know you. That's wonderful that you thought that, because that's exactly how I thought it would be. Like perhaps beginning with a solo voice, but then you have the addition of all these minor and major voices, and you have a symphony of sound, which is only the women's voices. And some are strident, some are raucous, some are not always tuneful, but it is the women's stories. That is really what I wanted it to be. But as I said, in publishing, sometimes you have to go for pragmatic. And so it's Song of Draupadi. But what has, like you were saying, it is, I was interested right from the beginning. It struck me how many of these women were functioning within a patriarchal construct. Now, there's no getting away from the fact that these were strictly constrained times. It was a patriarchy. There was no getting away from that. And a lot of these women were very much in that mold and were working from within that mold to do what they could to express their ambitions, their desires, whatever they wanted to do. And so I realized that right from the time, especially of Satyavati, you see. So when Shantanu remarries after Ganga's death, and he has a son already, Devavrata, the future Bhishma, he remarries, Satyavati. And this woman, this tribal woman, this fisher woman with really no background, with no power, she has realized that she went through a trauma in her early life where she had to be an unwed mother. And she was never going to let that happen to her again. She was going to control her destiny. And this made me realize that really a lot of what the Mahabharata is about, now we can talk about dharma and how it is all about philosophy and dharma, and that's all very well. But it's also about controlling women's wombs. Who will father whose child becomes king? These are very important questions when you're talking about two warring factions. And these women are very aware of this. So Satyavati, even though early in her life she was not in control of having her son who was Vyas, later on she realizes that this is what will make her powerful. So when she marries Shantanu, she says, yes, I will marry you, but my son will be king.
One condition, yes.
And that is the fracture of the Mahabharata. This is where the true Kuru heir, the future Bhishma, is in a way emasculated and set aside. And it is Satyavati's children, she says, they will be kings. So even though she's working within this patriarchal construct, she's using it to her own purposes.
She's gaining agency.
Yes, agency. She's reclaiming agency. When her daughters-in-law failed to become pregnant with her own sons from Shantanu, she called Vyas to impregnate these women so that they can bear sons. So you see the strength of her ambition, that she will be the mother of kings in one way or another. And I thought that was pretty fantastic. And we needed to see it from this point of view. And then follows all the other women, Ambika, Ambalika, Kunti, who's so powerful. Kunti, we always think of her as this bride and then as a mother. But what was she like before that? How did she grow up? How did she come to be in this state? So these were some of the things. One woman led to the next, very much so. But I wanted to explore that a little more.
I mean, I have an embarrassing confession. I read the Ramesh Menon Mahabharata. It's a 2-volume set. Now, while I was reading it, reading a feminist perspective on the Mahabharata means changing your own way of reading it in some ways. You have to shift. It's sort of a complete shift of perspective that you begin to look out for things.
Yes.
You begin to extract things. You begin to read between the lines and imagine as well. And in that sense, it adds to that mythology. You are yourself as a reader adding to that mythology. And what is interesting in your retelling, of course, is that the mythological elements have been removed almost. You don't hear about this divine impregnation so much. You don't know that Karna is a demigod. You aren't told that Amba is later reborn as Draupadi's brother, though there are versions of that as well. That being said, though, I do feel like it is an incredibly readable version of the text, both for people who have read the Mahabharata, who can fill in these gaps themselves, and for readers who've never picked it up, which is, for them it's like a very easy, smooth read. And then it gives way to further research, because I think that you'll inevitably end up, looking more.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to know, it's obviously a challenge to distill something so vast with so many versions into something which is concise and feels prolific, and it feels like it has done justice to the lives of these women.
Yes.
What was that challenge?
Yes. So, right in the beginning when I was thinking about these women, and in fact, these were thoughts that then led on to Heroines, my next book, is the way, the sort of understanding I had that, in India, we have this strange dichotomy that our historical women, the living, breathing women who have actually done things, who have lived and died and cried and done various things, they are transformed into goddesses. So whether you have Lakshmi Bai, she's this improbable woman forever on horseback, forever strapped with her baby to her back, whereas her life was actually much more complicated and messy than that. Mirabai, who did all sorts of, shocking things, who left her marital home while her husband was still alive and wrote these amazing songs. She's made into this white-clad widow-like figure who is, untouchable in her perfection. So our historical women are made into these impossible goddesses that we can never possibly strive to be, whereas, historical women should be attainable. And the mythological women are presented to us as role models. You be like Sita, even though this is a mythological woman, you will be like, this is someone for you to emulate. So I thought, okay, well, in that sense, if that is the case, then let me take on this challenge and present these women as much as possible as human beings. Let me see what their lives might have been if the agency was entirely theirs, if there is no Krishna coming in and giving these invisible layers of saris to drape Draupadi with, how might she save herself? Which, if you look at the critical edition, there is enough of Draupadi's words in that scene where she is telling the assembly, I am, the daughter of a king. I am married to kings. My in-laws are here and they are kings. How dare you treat me like this? There's such power in her fury, in her search for justice, that she can very well save herself. And in fact, Krishna later says that Draupadi saved her husbands like a ship in a stormy sea. She raised them up from the water. So you see, even Krishna admits the fact that she saves herself. So I wanted to explore this more thoroughly in every scene where there is, a divinity who appears to explain uncomfortable truths. Perhaps I wanted to remove those scenes. That sometimes unnecessary interruption by a divine being, and try and understand what is it hiding then. What are the women up to that we need all these divine beings once in a while to come and obscure the story? So that was the thinking behind it. And then how I did it was really just an awareness of women's lives, in India. So certain things like the effacement of a woman's name. It's so easy to say, oh, but this is her title. But no, what is her name? Let us get down to our name is so important. We all know that, right? It's something we live with our entire lives. It is our identity. But someone like Kunti, that is not her name. We all know her as Kunti. But almost my first, instinct is to find the real name of her. What was their name? Now, Kunti means Kunti Bhoja, the daughter of Kunti. But what was her name? So her name was Partha. So I put that down in the text. So whenever I can, Gandhari, I never did find.
Same thing. I was just going to say.
Yeah.
It's really sorry to interrupt you, but I had this thought when you mentioned the scene about Draupadi, the famous scene we all know where she is derobed, and you're mentioning that she takes control of the situation. The pragmatism of the question she asked the court is that, did my husband lose himself first or me?
Yes.
If he lost himself first, he couldn't possibly lose me after, because he has no possessions after that. And I love that scene. Even as we are talking, it sends goosebumps.
Yes, me too. Yes.
Right. And you render it so beautifully, and you render it so powerfully. There is a reclamation of that power in that scene. There are several instances of this which I found paralleling to everyday, at least how women are starting to do exactly this in our present day. And I could really see such a parallel, whether it is Draupadi's anger, which her husbands don't understand, maybe apart from him. They kind of almost cast it aside as though it's not important, and it's not even a fuel for them to get out of their situation. Or how Sushila, who works for her, who has to leave her own family behind. But then there's a scene that says, I've written it down, she says that the sacrifices are so pedestrian for a servant girl that it would not do to break one's heart over them. There are so many. And did you draw so much from the world that you were living in?
Yes, definitely. Like the character of Sushila doesn't exist in the Mahabharata. I just put her in there because I see, any of us who's living, in society in India will see the caste system, or just the binary of women's lives, how those who are not in power, not privileged, are living a very different existence from those who are privileged. And it is so matter of fact, even today, even in the 21st century, in urban homes, it is so normal that it is actually rare to mention it even. So I thought, let me put it in the text. And I don't want it to be, like a lecture, or for me to be, having a long diatribe about it. I want people to pick up on it accidentally, that, oh yes, this is true. This woman, no one's going to write her story. Who's going to write about Sushila, really?
But it's like you can't unread it after you read it.
Yeah.
Because it stays with you.
Yes, I'm glad, because that is the reality. It was the reality of many, many women's life, and it unfortunately continues to be there. The caste system, some of the issues with caste were things that shocked me. The way Kunti sacrificed that mother and her 5 children so easily to burn in the house of light because it saved her and her sons, because she was a tribal woman, a woman outside the caste system. This happened again and again, whether it was Bhim's liaison with Hidimbi and how they left her behind, and yet used the son out of that liaison when it suited them. It was quite harsh, and I must say it really shocked me. And I thought, let me just put these things for the readers to pick up on without it being, a lecture on the times or how we have to, how the caste system. I just want people to stumble upon these facts and say, oh wow, yeah, this is also how it happened.
Talk to me about the process of storytelling. What is told, what is untold, how to carry forward the story, and what is the task of the storyteller in this?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and one that really interests me. And the more I write, the more I see how much is actually it's scarily up to the writer to decide what they want to write about or the stories we want to tell, right? And there's an interesting scene in the Mahabharata which sort of gives us some lessons on who gets to be the guardian of stories. And it is just before the actual war of of Kurukshetra, and you have the Pandavas and the Kauravas are ready to wage war against each other, and the old king and queen Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, they are back in Hastinapura, yes, and they're both blind for different reasons. And Vyas offers Dhritarashtra the divine sight. He said, if you want to follow what's happening in the war, you can have this divine sight and follow everything yourself. And he refuses that, and he says, no, I want Sanjay, my charioteer, to go and come every day and relay these events to me. So he does not choose to see everything in an omniscient sense. It is already a filter, so he hears it. He doesn't see it. So it is the storytelling of a sort, and it allows Sanjay to tell him various people's stories. He tells Kunti what Kunti is going through, what Krishna is happening on the battlefield with the different players. So Dhritarashtra gets a certain sense of the war. When Gandhari is offered the same divine sight at the end of the war, she takes it to witness the widows of the Kaurav warriors, and she is guardian of their destitution and their grief and their pain. And if she weren't there to link all these stories together, we would have no sense of the great chaos and misery that was the effect of this terrible war. And she gives voice to these women. So you see in these two very different reactions, the same event, the Kurukshetra war, two very different interpretations, depending on who you feel empathy with, which side you want to, understand in a deeper sense, and who you give voice to. So this is something that endlessly fascinates me, and
It's so funny because I feel I work as an oral historian, and this answer of yours hits home. The various versions of a single event. So we have lots of questions from the audience, but actually I want to end our discussion with just one question. Did you have a favorite scene from your book that you wrote?
Yes, actually, I did have a favorite scene in the sense that the one that shocked me the most, because many of the others I was familiar with, we all grew up knowing various episodes, but the one that I was not that familiar with, whose interpretation I just stumbled upon while reading, was the Kaurav widows. What happens to them at the very end, after decades after the war, what happens, what is I don't want to obviously spell it all out, but what they are urged to do in the name of pragmatism, in the name of economic necessity. It was something that really shocked me, that told me something about the status of widows in India, even such a long time ago. Sometimes we tend to idealize things and say, oh, back then it was fine, widows had a much better status, but they didn't. And so that scene of the widows at the end of the war, it's one of my favorite ones. It's the one I felt most strongly about. And I feel it is one that will be unusual to a lot of readers. They would not have encountered it possibly in other storytelling.
I thought of the balance of the earth a lot when I read that.
Yes.
Who can make the balance of the earth almost complete? Okay, let me get to these questions now. Sita is one of the first names one thinks of when writing about women in mythology. Can we expect a retelling of her story soon?
So you see, because I wrote Song of Draupadi as my first manuscript many years ago now, 8 to 10 years ago, and now I'm firmly in the non-fiction sort of field, and I have many commitments now going forward. So I don't think I personally would be writing any more mythology. And Sita is definitely worth redeeming a little bit because of the way she is presented to us as a very often a unidimensional character. And hers is a very tragic story. And when we end the Ramayana at that scene where they all are reunited as a merry family, Ram and Sita, that is not the end of it. We must go beyond that and explore the consequences of that. So there's definitely something worth writing there, but it won't be my story to tell.
Mm-hmm. Why was the war, being the significant part of the Mahabharata, covered only in a short period of your rendition?
Yes, so that's a very important and interesting question, and I think the answer is that I wanted to see how all the events of the Mahabharata, the ones leading the war, is just the end of it really, but there are many things set in motion before that war has to come about. Why did that war have to come about? Apart from the philosophical idea that the earth wanted to rid itself of all these troubling human beings. But if you think about in terms of what was the chain of action, how the women were important in those chains of actions, that is what I was really interested in. The war itself, I wanted to see how it affected the women. The women were not themselves out on horseback, on chariots, fighting the war. So since my point of view and my filter is very strongly that of the women. So I wanted the reader to get that sense of that the war is happening outside the window somewhere. The women are inside talking to each other, talking about how the war has come about. The battles are actually just a distraction in the distance, but what happens around the battle is what influences and has a consequence on the women. So that's why I very purposely set aside the battle scenes themselves.
And they almost come across like reportage.
Yes.
This has happened, that has happened, his or her son has died.
Yes.
And I felt like it really shifted the perspective in terms of who we consider to be the important protagonists of the story and who are the secondary characters.
Correct.
Because you do get a sense of why am I reading about these women when they're not doing anything. They're just sitting.
Yes.
They're just talking.
Yeah.
They're playing dice. That's it. And everything is happening there. And then you do have to reconfigure your thoughts a little bit.
Yes. And also maybe a question: what is worth writing about? What constitutes right? Is it always the war, or is it say the transmission of language? Why is it always the increased land that we get to have? Why is that the focus of all human history?
Yeah, and also like challenge the conventional storytelling, right? I mean, if you have sought out to do a song of women, then So the last question I want to ask, because we are nearing the end, is I read a piece that asked the question, how many Draupadis is too many Draupadis? And I want to know from you, will we ever saturate our appetite for the retelling of mythological epics like Mahabharata and Ramayana?
Yes, well, these epics are approximately 2,500 years old, give or take a few centuries, because the scholars are not entirely sure. It's difficult to date. They were probably written over a period of several hundred years. So, taking 2,500 years, of storytelling of the epics existing, I think the stories of the women have been told for about the last 20 years. Let us say we have seen an focus and increased attention. Of course, there was Iravati Karve writing 50 years ago, but basically the last 20-25 years. So if we say that we have been talking about the men for 2,500 years and about the women for 20 years, so I would just say that we have another 2,000 years of writing about the women to go before we even reach an equilibrium and say, okay, enough talking about the women. That is just to give you an idea of whenever we see anything in the world, whenever we do bring up women's voices, gender issues, there is sometimes a pushback and a backlash saying, but haven't we now done enough for women? And the answer is no. Nowhere have we done enough for women. Even today in Afghanistan, in Kabul, who are we most worried about? The women and children. This is our reality that we have to really counter for many, many hundreds of years before things are even vaguely at an equilibrium. So that's to do with the women's issue. But as to the epics themselves, I think they talk about such basic human desires and ambitions and things that interest us that I don't think that they will ever go out of fashion. They are just too they have just too much in them. They're not simplistic stories. And layered and rich and complicated and complex, and they satisfy many of our quests. So I don't think we will run out of ideas.
Well, for those of you watching us, this is the book Song of Draupadi. You can get it at Crossword Bookshop or any other bookshop or online. Ira, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. And I guess I should hand over to Keith from Crossword or Gitu from Aleph. Or not?
Maybe not.
Maybe this is a sign that our conversation should have gone on for longer.
Yes, well, it was a lot of fun talking to you, Anchal. We should have done this for longer, but I have a feeling that this was the time we were given.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you for your time, Ira. It was lovely.
Thank you, Anchal, and thank you to Crossword, and thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.